Can you hear me okay, just before I start?
Yeah.
So basically what I'm trying to show is the link between Oxford, Ohio and Wetzlar, Germany. Wetzlar is the headquarters of Leica Camera AG. And obviously Miami University Art Museum has a Leica collection, which I'll show you a little bit later. Just for a little bit of historical background, I've been going through a bunch of old photo albums, and I found an album I put together in 1956 when I was 10. And so I was into cameras then. They're black and white pictures taken with a Kodak Brownie, but I guess I started early. When I was in high school, I worked at Snyder's and framing pictures with Mike Dollaboy. And I don't know if you remember, but Snyder's had a pretty good camera section. And so I had access to some really nice cameras working at Snyder's. So that kept me going through high school and into college. And then when I went in the Army after graduating from Miami, I spent a year in Vietnam as an infantry officer, and we had access to a thing called the Pacific Mail Order Exchange, which was a PX, a global PX that they would mail stuff to you, and you had access to all sorts of things, really nice cameras or whatever. Kathy used to say we went broke saving money through the Pacific Exchange. So I shot probably over 1,000 slides when I was in Vietnam, and one of my Christmas presents to my kids this year, I digitized those slides. And I think they were hoping for something more than that, but I wanted to preserve them because the slides were starting to fade. And so that's what I did. After coming back from the Army, I came back to Oxford and went to work with my dad in the insurance business. And I started taking photographs of tennis tournaments. We had a tournament in Cincinnati and a number of others around this area. And I switched from Pentax cameras to Canon cameras. I did that for about 30 years, 15 years of which I spent at the US Open as the assistant to the head of the USTA, the head chief photographer of the USTA, Russ Adams. And that was quite an experience. And in fact, he's the only photographer inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. In that period of time, I had one photograph in Sports Illustrated, which I lucked out on. But probably in about 2000, I started getting out of the tennis business and just started taking pictures. I call it grandkid sports, pictures of my grandchildren playing different sports and things in school. But I also got interested in Leica, which is a camera company out of Germany that goes back into the 1800s. And originally they made microscopes. This is their headquarters in Wetzlar, Germany. They are located, as you can tell, sort of out in the farmlands. And the headquarter building, if you look down on top of it, it actually looks like a pair of binoculars because one of their divisions specializes in sports optics and binoculars and things of that sort. The building to the right is their hotel, the Ernst Hotel. And that sign Wetzlar down below is where they make lenses for for motion picture photography. Those are like $30,000 lenses that they would put on a camera to make a movie with. A little bit of a close-up of the headquarter building. Most of this was built about 2014, so it's all pretty new. If you, from where that last picture was, if you did an about face and look back, there's the hotel on the left. The motion picture lens place on the right. That 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-story building is the headquarters. That's where the owner has his office. And then straight back is their museum and their company store there in Wetzlar. That black rectangle at the top is supposed to look like a viewfinder on a camera. That looks a little bit different. This is Dr. Andres Kaufman. He is the owner of Leica cameras. He's from Austria. His family has a lot of money, and he basically saved this company. If he hadn't invested in it, I don't think Leica would exist today. He sold off 45% of it to BlackRock, but he still owns 55% and totally controls it. He's quite an interesting gentleman, and he's, as I say, I think personally that he's the one that's responsible for Leica being here because a lot of the camera companies, Nikon and some others, are having problems because everybody's using their iPhones and they're not buying cameras anymore. This is a picture I took of Dr. Kaufman in Boston last year, and the gentleman to his right, my left, is his sales manager for the United States, Jim Wagner. This is Dr. Kaufman's office. This tour was very behind the scenes, and he didn't happen to be in town that day, but he let us visit his office. One real quick story: that little green Incredible Hulk that's sitting on his desk, that was sent to him by one of the guys that was in our little group of 6, Marcos, who lives in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I don't know why he picked the Incredible Hulk, but we walked into the office and found that Dr. Kaufman had put it on his desk, and for whatever reason. So Marcus had his picture, it sat in Dr. Kaufman's chair and then had a picture taken. He was pretty excited about that. We've been able to see where they make the lenses. We've been able to see where they maintain the cameras if you send it in to be worked on. I have yet to see them actually build the camera bodies. The times we've been there, they've been on lockdown because they're coming out with new models and they're afraid that somebody would send a picture of something they're working on. So this particular photograph is of the lens construction section, and it's very interesting. There's a process, and I don't exactly know what they're doing, but there's a process towards the end of the construction of the lens where it requires some polishing. And there are only 5 women in the whole company that can do it. They've tried to train men to do it. They can't. They don't have the touch. And God help them if something happens to the 5 women. But they have the touch, and all of this stuff is made by hand. So that's a big difference between Leica and, say, Nikon or Canon and the others, which are normally made by machines. These are all put together by people. Very little plastic in the cameras themselves. They're all brass or titanium or some other metal, and they're a little heavier than some of the others, but they also last, and their lenses are second to none as far as the quality of them. This is basically what they were trying to do. That big box is what a typical camera would look like in the early 1900s. And usually it was only professionals that used them. They would need somebody to help them carry it around, obviously, because that's pretty big. And so Leica came up with the idea, the Leiss family came up with the idea of making a small camera like the one you see. The film they were using, they developed a 35mm film. That was actually movie film. They made movie cameras with and used movie film in the cameras. But the 35mm film, they could either do 20 or 35 photographs, 20 or 36 photographs at a time once they got going. Unfortunately, they started about 1914, and this is their first camera. It's called the Your Leiss, and World War II started, or World War I started right around there, and that kind of brought everything to a screeching halt. They did have some photographs taken with this camera, and this is a photograph off of screen of the original picture taken with that camera in Wetzlar, Germany. That, if you go to that spot now and stand on this manhole cover where you have a picture of the camera and look up, that's what that looks like today. So this is the picture on the right is the one I took of that, and the picture of the left was whoops, picture on the left was the original 1914 photograph. And what amazes me, the fact that it's in Germany and with all the bombing and everything else, that this place even still exists, but it does. And they even have to the left of you on the wall, they have instructions in English and German about how to take the photograph, you know, horizontal, vertical, and how far back to get and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of cute. This was an ad for their original cameras that they came out with. And in 1923, they produced, they weren't going major production yet. They built 26 prototype cameras, which they handed out to various people that were customers of theirs to try out. Each one of them was different. And of the 26 cameras, only 16 are known to exist today. and only one of them that I'm aware of is on public view, and that's the one in Oxford, Ohio. This particular camera, number 122, went to auction in Vienna in March of 2018. Was listed for something like 400,000 euro, and it went for almost $3 million. It is the most expensive camera, according to Guinness Book of World Records. It was purchased by somebody who lives in Hong Kong, and it was shipped to Hong Kong, and that's where it is today. It was given to some charity by a gentleman who wanted to give him some money, but instead of writing a check, he just gave him the camera and said, "Here, see what you get for it if you take it to auction." And it was, as I said, it was listed in the auction catalog at 400,000 euro, but obviously went for a lot more than that. This is a photograph a friend of mine, Jim Lager, took. It's a shot shooting down on top of it, and you can see the serial number 122. Lager is probably the preeminent historian of Leica cameras, and he used to work for Leica, and he had access to stuff like this and could take photographs of it. And he just sent me this during Christmas. His book is so well thought of that this is a photograph of a technician's desk in the factory. In other words, if you sent your camera in to be repaired, he would be working on it. There's Jim's 3-volume set of Leica history up there, so if he needs to find out anything historical, he would go to that book and get his information. This is Leica's. Leica only has one of these now. They used to have two. They had 104 and 119. They sold 104 back in the early 2000s because they needed some money. This one, 119, is, they don't display it. It's in a bank vault. In fact, they have the best collection of Leica cameras in the world, and the two most expensive ones, this one and the original camera, in a bank vault. And they have replicas that are in their place. This is that camera body with the base plate off. And I don't know the difference, but the people that know the difference can look at that and tell you that this is an original based on what you see with that base plate off. One side note, if you bought a Leica camera now and turned it over and took the base plate off, the same mechanism is used in 2020-21 that was used in 1923. So here is their display of their $1 million camera, except that's a replica. That's not the original. And if you look down in the lower left-hand corner, it says that this is a replica. All right, so across the pond to Oxford, Ohio, and this is the Miami University Art Museum. A gentleman by the name of Charles Messer. He and his brother owned a company which still exists today, Messer Construction. They were responsible for probably most of the construction that takes place on Miami's campus since the 40s all the way to right now. You can drive down on campus and see their signs all over the place. He was having some health problems, and he asked his doctor what he should do, and the doctor said, "You need a hobby. If you don't get a hobby, you're not going to survive." And so he went to his brother, Frank, and he said, "What do you do?" And he says, "I'm a photographer. I'm an amateur photographer. I take pictures and stuff." Well, Charles Messer tried taking pictures, and he was not very good at it. So instead of taking photographs, he decided to collect them, and he selected Leica as the brand that he was going to collect. Mr. Lager, who I mentioned before, was one of the people that he would turn to seek out cameras for him to buy. And one of the ones he had him buy was Miami's 114, which I'll show you in a second, which is Miami's $1 million camera. Whoops, hold on. Okay, so the Messer, sorry, Bri, the Messer, Charles Messer gave his collection to Miami University, 1972, I believe, and I've actually seen the letter that he wrote, and it was signed by him, and it was signed off by Dr. Shriver. He gives the entire collection to the university, and I don't think his family was real happy. I think they were hoping they were going to get it, but they didn't. He stipulated that they had to maintain the cameras. One, they couldn't sell the collection, and they couldn't give the collection away piecemeal. They're going to give it away. They had to give away the whole thing. So when I mentioned this to Dr. Crawford, what the value of this camera was, he said, well, let's sell it. I said, well, actually you can't because of this agreement. But originally when the collection was put together and given to the university and they built the present art museum building, there was a separate room in there in the back that housed the collection. And this was a photograph taken in the 1980s of that room. It's now used as an office. And the people in the picture on the left is David Wendt, who was an undergraduate at Miami then. He's a professional photographer in Cincinnati. And David had the dream job in my book, which was to look after these cameras, and they were supposed to use them. They were supposed to take them out and advance the film in them and do stuff like that, so they knew that they worked. So that would, I mean, and he got paid to do that. That was the incredible part. The next gentleman is Russ Adams, my tennis photography friend. He actually was under contract with Leica for a number of years and used Leica equipment. And then there's my father. And that little guy is my son. That's Brian. But this is what this room looked like when it was set up. Now, there was more displayed there than when they went to the, this is what it's displayed as now. There are a few items displayed, but more people know about it. They'll walk by it and they'll see it, even if they weren't looking for it when they go to the museum. Whereas when it was in a separate room like that, I have a feeling the only people that would actually see it were those that knew it was there and would make arrangements to have a private tour or something of that sort. So that's the way the collection is set up right now. That camera on the shelf, number 2, is number 114. And that is Miami's $1 million camera. I was fortunate enough to be able to take some photographs of it, and I sent them back via email to a gentleman in Wetzlar who is the preeminent person to determine values of cameras and stuff. He had a photograph of it with the base plate off, and as soon as he saw that, in 28 minutes, he wrote back and he said, that's original. That lens cap is not. That's something that somebody added to it, and that is not original, but that's probably the way it came when Mr. Messer bought it for his collection. This is a picture I took. You can see, barely you can see the 114 number up next to the viewfinder. And there's the base plate off. That white ink is just, that's it. It's not white ink, that's engraved. In fact, that was the first question that was asked of me. He said, tell me they didn't engrave those letters and numbers on there. And I said, no, they did not. So he said, good, because that would have really messed up the values. But he and Mr. Lager came up with an appraisal, which the university's insurance company accepted, and it's insured for $1 million. This small little 1923 camera. Now, I was of the opinion that maybe they ought to display a replica as opposed to the original camera. And because if Leica has the biggest collection in the world and they value it so much that they don't want to display the original, maybe Miami should do the same thing. There's been some disagreement on that. I did locate 2 replica cameras of that series that were made in 2000. I found one in London and one in Scotland, and I've given one to Miami, so they actually have this. And these actually work. I'll show you another couple pictures trying to load some film into it. But those are exact replicas. The only difference is the serial numbers on them are in the 200,000 as opposed to 114 or 119 or 122. So I've been to Wetzlar twice. I was supposed to go in June, but obviously nobody was traveling then. On our second trip, we had dinner one night with this guy, Stefan Daniel. He is the head of all camera and photography for Leica. He'd be like the third person responsible for things at Leica. And I asked him at dinner if he'd show me how to put film in this thing. He said, sure. So that's what he's doing. I happen to have a roll of Tri-X film, which is not easy to get. I gave it to him, and he's cutting it there, and he puts it in the camera. And then he instructs the gentleman across from us to take a picture of us. And he says, now be very careful, because after you take the picture, you need to put the lens cap back on before you advance the film. Otherwise, the film gets fogged. The gentleman that's taking the picture is is the best Leica technician in the world. He's an independent contractor now, but he is the only guy that Leica trusts with their $1 million stuff to work on. And so he takes the picture, and what does he do? He just advances it like that. And Stefan goes, dude, I said, you got to put the lens cap back on. He says, oh, let's take some more. So that's what he's doing. He's taken several pictures of Stefan and me with this camera. To be real honest, I never developed a film. I couldn't figure out how to get it out. So, I mean, I'm totally digital now, and I don't even know what film is. The gentleman with the flash in the background behind Stefan's wife is Marcus. He's the guy that came up with the Incredible Hulk. One of the other things we did was to visit the home site of the Leitz family. Leitz family owned Leica until probably early 2000s. And this was an estate that they have up in the hills above there. And it's part of it's a museum, part of it's rented out. We were fortunate to have this gentleman, Newt Leitz, who is the grandson of the guy who decided they were going to make cameras and go into the camera business. He had been an executive with Leica for a number of years, and unfortunately, after our tour, he passed away. So if we had gone there in June, we would not have been able to see him. But here he is giving us a overview of the original office building, and then up the hill, this lovely home. And here we are in the home, getting a tour of this is sort of like a place where they had books and things laid out. The second guy from the right, that's Mr. Lager. He's the one that sent me that black and white picture of 122. This was a very special tour because it wasn't like you were walking around with a docent or somebody. He's obviously really into the family photos and things of that sort. One of my favorite was this picture. That's a picture of Newt back in the 60s. And then to his right, my left, the little guy with the camera upside down, that's him as a little boy, probably about 3 years old, trying to figure out what the heck to do with that Leica camera. I got a chuckle out of that, considering that's what their family business was. During World War II, you've heard of Schindler's List. Leica made arrangements to get about 1,500 employees, Jewish German employees, out of the country before all the really horrible stuff started happening. And one of the people responsible for that was his mother. She was a lawyer by training, and towards the end of the war, she actually was jailed by the Gestapo for what she had done. And the family had to pay a ransom to get her back out. But she is, a true, in my opinion, she's a true hero for what she was able to do and still survive. If you go back to the headquarters, they have a wall of famous pictures, and I'll show you a few of these. You can see Che Guevara and Muhammad Ali up there, but these are all photographs throughout history that have been taken with Leica cameras. And this, for example, is a shot of the Hindenburg.
Wow.
This was taken by Robert Capa, a very famous picture taken in during the Spanish Civil War of a soldier being killed. That's basically what it was. And that was shot with a Leica camera. Henri Cartier-Bresson, he's probably the most famous photographer to use Leica equipment. And this was one of his portraits. And then this one, I think you'll recognize. This was taken by Alfred Eisenstadt at the end of World War II in Times Square. And he actually was in Oxford. He came here in the mid-'80s and received an honorary degree from Miami. And I remember Mike Dolliver and I went to a lecture that he put on where he was showing the pictures and what he was thinking about when he was doing all the pictures and stuff. And then they had an exhibition of his work at the art museum, and he autographed books and things of that sort. Very interesting man. He spent his entire career working for Life magazine and just was very prolific as far as being a photographer. This was the Russians capturing the Reichstag in Berlin. That was taken with a Leica. And then this, if you get closer to the Vietnam area, that was 50 years ago. This famous photograph, this little girl had been burned by napalm in Vietnam. That was taken by a gentleman who actually is still an active photographer. He lives out in California, I believe. But these are all photographs taken by photographers using Leica equipment. That was our group. These are the guys I traveled with a year and a half ago. It was absolutely incredible. I mean, it's definitely behind the scenes. When you get to sit in the owner's desk chair and see some of this other stuff, it was definitely behind the scene. And we were supposed to go, as I said, in June. That didn't happen. And right now it looks like we may go in September. The one thing they would add to it is they have a factory in Portugal. Germans had a tariff placed on them by the United States in a war over Airbus. And they raised the price of Leica lenses by 25%. So a lot of their stuff, which was manufactured in Germany, is now being made in Portugal and then sent to Germany for the final finishing and packaging and stuff. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them.
Tom, this is Bob Thurston. I was just wondering about Kodak and what, if anything, Leica learned from Kodak, because Kodak had made small portable cameras, the Brownie, by 1900, and they were very inexpensive, and people could change their own film and so on. As I recall, at that time, Kodak had roll film in their cameras. Did Leica draw anything from Kodak, or just develop everything on its own?
I would say they probably did it on their own. If you get into the digital age, Kodak obviously came to that late, but Leica also did too. There's a very detailed article written in the early 2000s about Leica and how they almost missed it, but they turned it around thanks to Dr. Kaufman. But pretty much everything is digital now. The portable cameras, that was huge. I mean, they were in a business that manufactured microscopes. That's primarily what they did prior to getting into the camera business. And they still make microscopes. There's a Leica Microscope company in Wetzlar that's a sister company. It's not owned by Dr. Kaufman. It's owned by another entity, but they still make really, really fine microscopes. But I would guess from what I've learned about them that they probably pick most of the stuff up on their own as opposed to maybe getting something from Kodak.
Tom, this is Lee Fisher.
Yes, sir.
The last decade, I've been involved in professional auto racing here in Florida. And I'm with professional photographers trackside all the time. And in the last 10 years, these professional photographers shooting race cars tell me they're now shooting with digital cameras that can take 200 frames a second. And I talked to one last year that said they're shooting for 500 frames a second. Do you know anything about that technology and the thing that allows them to advance that far?
I don't know about the technology. I know Leica has a camera called a Leica Q2, and one of the gentlemen on the trip with me, older fellow, is a retired 4-star admiral. He bought a Q2 while we were over there, and in about an hour, he had totally filled up the SD card, the digital card on it. And he couldn't figure out what was wrong, and so I looked at it, and there are settings in there for taking a single shot, multiple shots, low, medium, high, and then there's like hyperspeed, and his was set at hyperspeed. So he probably shot about 50,000 pictures in about an hour because of that. And if you want to stop the action, that would definitely be the way to do it.
Yeah.
Tom, this is Dan. In talking with these folks, what do they see as the way going forward with their business, given what's happening with you know, cameras or excuse me, phones, smartphones, that kind of thing?
They, fortunately for them, they sell equipment that's at a higher level than most other cameras. Nikon is struggling right now. Canon I can't answer for, but Nikon I know is struggling. And if you look at any of the graphs of sales on cameras as we know them, after the iPhones came out, they just dropped like a rock. Dr. Kaufman actually wants to get into the phone business. His cameras are in one of the leading cell phones that are used, but he wants to have a Leica camera. So that's something he's working on. They have, you know, their cameras range anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 just for the body. I mean, they've got some lenses that go for $15,000, and so they're not the same as a Canon or Nikon lens, and so they're in that respect they're dealing with another market. But the quality is there, and the where they're picking up a lot of stuff is in the manufacturing of the lenses for the movie industry. They've really established a niche in that with the cameras. They don't make the bodies, they don't make the camera, they just make the lens, and those run about $35,000 to $40,000 a piece. So they're definitely looking at other ways of doing things, and obviously the coronavirus putting a hold on a lot of stuff has been an issue, but I'm hopeful that they will continue. And as long as you have a guy like Dr. Kaufman who's willing to put all his money into it, it's going to be fine. If he were to say, I'm getting tired of this, that would be an issue.
I think it's illustrative of the historic quality of the camera that a Russian combat photographer at the Reichstag in 1945 was using a German camera.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. They actually there were cameras that were made with, they made some for the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and they had the Luftwaffe logo on them. There is one in the, maybe one or even two in the Messer collection with that. They don't, you have to look to find them. They don't display them a lot, but yeah, they actually made cameras for the German military to use.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Tom, you know, I didn't think about cameras for the last long time, and what you presented is so interesting and
Thank you.
informative. Thank you very much. We'll put a book in the Lane Library in honor of your presentation because it was just an outstanding presentation.
Great.